Welcome to Built, Wired, and Secured, the podcast where we explore how modern buildings are designed, connected, and protected in the real world. I'm Alex Morgan, and in today's episode, we're diving into lifecycle strategies to prevent building tech surprises, why it matters, where projects usually go wrong, and what decision makers need to understand before problems show up in production. Joining me today is Michael Harrington, and together we'll break this down from a practical, real-world perspective.
Cold open. Picture this: a downtown office building, peak weekday morning. An access control controller hits end of life mid-shift. Locks fail to respond, and tenants can't get into core areas for 2 hours while operations scramble for a replacement. Elevators keep people in limbo, contractors rush parts, and tenants call the property team furious. That 2-hour outage cost more than lost rent for the day. It dented tenant trust and kicked off an emergency capital request no one budgeted for.
In 10 minutes, we're going to make life cycle planning feel practical, not bureaucratic. You'll leave with 5 concrete actions you can put into your next planning cycle, so surprises like that become rare instead of routine.
From an operational standpoint, surprises like that are almost always avoidable. What breaks if this goes down? That's the first question I ask. Most teams discover they never cataloged that dependency, or they relied on a single spare that turned out to be incompatible. The life cycle ends silently until it doesn't.
Let's unpack why this happens. Michael, walk us through the common root causes you see that lead to unexpected end-of-life events on building systems.
There are a few repeating patterns. First, procurement and installation look at short-term price and schedule, not life cycle. Teams buy what's available now, maybe to meet a move-in deadline, and the device sits on a 5-year clock nobody tracked. Second, documentation gaps. Handovers from contractors often lack EOL or firmware records. Third, spare parts. We found spare closets full of mismatched parts that won't work together. And finally, vendor lifecycle policies. Manufacturers announce end of support quietly, and if you don't have an EOL calendar, you learn about it during an outage. Those root causes stack until something fails at the worst time.
That aligns with what we hear from owners. Decisions made to hit move-in dates or savings targets can create invisible risk. Michael, can you give an example that highlights how these patterns manifest on a real project?
Sure. We had one campus where a legacy HVAC controller family had been phased by the vendor. The system still warmed and cooled fine, so facilities deprioritized upgrades. Then a firmware issue on a gateway left several rooftop units uncontrolled. The vendor supplied a patch, but only for supported models. Because a few controllers were older, those units needed physical replacement. Emergency crane time, unbudgeted capital, tenant complaints about temperature swings. That's fine until it fails, and the downstream impact was a week of tenant disruption and higher repair costs than a staged refresh would have been.
Let's move into trade-offs. Property leaders often face a choice: phased, staged refreshes, or a single big bang replacement. Michael, what are the pros and cons of each from both a cost and operational perspective?
Phased refresh smooths capital spend and reduces tenant disruption if planned around vacancy or low-risk windows. It lets you pilot compatibility and validate integrations before full rollout. The downside is mixed fleets. Older and newer gear can complicate management and increase spare part diversity. Big bang replacements create uniformity, easier management, fewer compatibility surprises, but they require a large capital outlay and a tight schedule that risks tenant disruption during cutover. From an operational standpoint, you ask, what parts of the building are mission critical, and can they tolerate phased risk? That informs the chosen path.
Cybersecurity complicates that choice. Aging hardware often lacks current security features and may not receive patches. How should decision makers factor security into lifecycle planning?
Security should be baked into the lifecycle calendar. If hardware is approaching end of support, it becomes an elevated risk item. You either accelerate replacement in areas with sensitive systems, or you segment, isolate, and harden the legacy devices until they can be retired. From an operational standpoint, ask, what breaks if this goes down or is compromised? That prioritizes higher risk gear for earlier refresh. Also consider vendor commitments to patching when you evaluate long-term support during procurement.
Okay, so we've covered causes and trade-offs. Let's get tactical. Walk me through an operational playbook, the practical steps a facilities or IT leader should adopt next week.
Start with an asset inventory. Tag every device that impacts operations, note model, serial, firmware, purchase date, and warranty. Then create an EOL calendar tied to those records. Second, build spare part kits for critical systems. Test those spares regularly. Third, formalize vendor handovers. Require EOL, support windows, firmware baselines, and runbooks on acceptance. Fourth, budget for a reserve, a lifecycle reserve that smooths large replacements over years. Finally, run tabletop exercises for likely failure scenarios so your team knows the runbook steps before an outage.
Can you share a brief example where those plays worked? A place that avoided a major outage because of good lifecycle practices?
Yes, a multi-tenant lab building we worked with had a documented EOL calendar and a small spare warehouse. When a lab access controller began failing intermittently, they pulled a tested spare, swapped it during a scheduled low occupancy window, and pushed a firmware rollback across the fleet. Tenants noticed no interruption. The capital spend was planned in the next fiscal quarter, and what could have been a disruptive emergency became a routine maintenance task. That's the downstream impact of planning.
Great. Let's close with 5 quick, actionable takeaways, things listeners can put into their next planning cycle right away.
Number 1. Build and maintain an asset inventory with EOL dates. Number 2. Create a lifecycle reserve budget. Treat refreshes as planned capital, not emergencies. Number 3. Standardize and test spare kits for mission-critical systems. Number 4. Require vendor handover documentation that includes support windows and firmware baselines. Number 5. Run tabletop scenarios and document runbooks so teams can execute without scrambling.
Those 5 moves, inventory, reserve budget, refresh calendar, runbooks, and vendor coordination, reduce both cost and operational risk. If you want templates for an EOL calendar and a sample spare parts kit, visit our site and download the checklist we mentioned at the top of the show. That wraps up today's episode of Built, Wired, and Secured. We covered lifecycle planning to prevent surprise outages and the practical steps that help buildings keep running reliably. Thanks to Michael Harrington for joining us and sharing operational examples and hard-won lessons. Thanks for spending time with us. Until next time, make sure the systems you're responsible for are built to last, wired with intention, and secured for the real world.
One final thought. Planning is less about predicting every failure and more about creating repeatable habits. That consistency is what saves you time, money, and tenant trust over the long run.